The last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John, is arguably one of the most difficult bits of the Bible, and many Christians prefer to overlook it entirely. Even Martin Luther in the 16th century said that the letter to the seven churches of Asia ought to be returned to sender. And John Calvin, although he wrote commentaries on virtually the whole of the New Testament, somehow managed to overlook the book of Revelation. And the book itself has been mined over the years by many people from different backgrounds and for different reasons, and different people have brought different things out of it. Some of those things quite disturbing, and arguably it's a disturbing book. For that reason and for others as well, some of us maybe prefer not to engage with the book of Revelation. Yet it's my conviction that it's a really important book. The book starts with an affirmation that this is the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, and continues, "Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near." That seems to suggest that God doesn't want us to ignore the book of Revelation. What follows is a series of 8 Bible studies in which I'll be joined by folk from my local churches. I'm not an academic, I'm a minister in a pastoral appointment, but I've wrestled with the book of Revelation throughout my Christian life, and wanted to do this series of Bible studies for some time now, because I have a conviction that the book of Revelation is a message for us today, that it's a message of hope in a time of crisis, and that there's a great deal to be learned from and gained from engaging with those scriptures. So over this series of 8 studies, I'll be joined by folk from some of my churches in a Zoom. So please accept my apologies for the ums and the ahs. It's not a formal presentation. It's not a professional presentation at all. But I hope that through these studies, you'll join with us in delving into these scriptures and discerning what God is saying to us through them. We shall begin with an introduction which looks at the style of the letter, because unless we understand the style of the letter, the type of writing that it is, we're prone to making all kinds of mistakes in our interpretation of it. So we're going to spend a bit of time in the first session just looking at the background, the context in which it appeared, and the style that's used in communicating the message. So I hope you'll bear with us, and I hope you'll get great benefit from this, and I hope that you'll approach this study prayerfully, as I've sought to do as well, that we'll hear the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, and we'll be blessed as we do so. With that said, let's just have a brief prayer before we see the introductory session. Gracious God, you are Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end, and your word is life. As we sometimes struggle with your word in understanding it and in applying it, we pray that you would give us wisdom and insight as we look at the book of Revelation, that the Spirit who inspired its writing would also inspire our hearts and minds, that we might be more faithful disciples of Jesus Christ through hearing your word. And as you have pronounced us blessed as we hear and read that word, may that blessing be a reality, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of the world that you love. We ask our prayer in the name of Jesus Christ, your word made flesh. Amen. And so without further ado, here's the recording of the first session of our study on the book of Revelation. God bless you. I'm going to just share with you on the screen a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, because the book of Revelation is rooted in our world. It might seem to us to be rooted in another world, but actually it is very concerned with what's happening in our world and how we are to interpret that. So I'm going to just show you, as I say, a map of the Eastern Mediterranean to give you an idea of where we are located in the world, and that will help us to begin to unpack what the book of Revelation is all about. You'll see the Eastern Mediterranean there, and what is now called Turkey. Turkey in New Testament times was Asia, in the Roman province of Asia, or Asia Minor, as it came to be called. And you'll see that it's some way from Israel, where the biblical story is mostly set. And a close-up of Turkey showing the churches which are addressed in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. You'll see that we've got Ephesus in the middle and slightly to the left of the map here. To the left of Ephesus, or should I say to the west as a geographer, is the island of Samos. And southwest of Samos is the island of Patmos. These churches are located in the southwestern corner of what is modern Turkey. You'll see there are a number of other places around the 7 churches which are marked in red, which are also known from our New Testament. Colossae, Paul wrote a letter to the church at Colossae. There was also a church at Hierapolis to which Paul refers in one of his letters. Places like Miletus also get mentioned in the pages of the New Testament. But this is the part of the world in which we are set. I want to just ask at this point, give us a wave and unmute yourself and tell us, has anybody visited this area, and in particular been to somewhere like Ephesus or Patmos? I know 1 or 2 have. Dan, tell us where you've been. I can't unmute you. Oh, there we go. Sorry. That's all right.
Have you unmuted? It's 2003. It sounds really posh. We went on the Bible Lands cruise to that area, and the best part was going to Patmos, right, because all this came alive. And I just imagine who John was and how old he was and whether it was the cave. It was wonderful.
Lovely, thank you, Dan. And Klaus and Anna, I think you were showing you've been in that part of the world.
Patmos, yeah, Patmos from Kos.
From Patmos from Kos.
Yeah, took a look at that cave.
I've never been to Patmos, but we did do. Alex and I did the Church of the 7 Churches in 2012, I think it was, or 13, and it really brings home to you the reality of that part of the world. June, have you been there? You're nodding.
I've only been to Ephesus. I haven't been to any of the others. But it's quite amazing, to stand in that library building and think that, Paul was there in that library. It's fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So we're in a part of the world which may be strange to most of us. I will show you occasional holiday snaps of our trip, not Alex's and I's trip to Scotland or anything like that, but to that part of the world, because they do help us to ground ourselves in that part of the world. But we're looking at a part of the world which was very important to the Roman Empire. It was Middle Empire, just as people sometimes talk about Middle England. This part of the Roman Empire was, for the Romans, Middle Empire. It was well established. It had been under their control for a couple of centuries and dominated by them. And we read in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9 that John was on the island of Patmos, to which we've already referred. He says, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now, Patmos was a prison island for the Romans. It's believed that John may have been there because of his faithfulness to Christ and as part of a kind of persecution, but it's not necessarily the case. It could have been that it was part of a preaching tour that Christian preachers took to visit the prison, as it were, and that John was there just as a prison visitor and preacher. We don't really know, but probably the more likely thing is that he was there as a result of his testimony to Jesus as a prisoner. As I say, we're not entirely sure. And it's believed that this was about the year 96 AD, the end of the 1st century. So we're talking a little over 60 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And by this time, the Christian church has become well established throughout that part of the world, in all of those places that we looked at. Paul visited a number of times, and there was a large Christian church in Ephesus, which is the nearest part of the mainland to Patmos. The emperor at the time was Domitian. He was not an active persecutor of Christians, as far as we know, but one thing that he did do was to establish what was called the imperial cult in Ephesus in AD 89. He was part of what's called the Flavian dynasty. That's his family, the family of Flavius. And he established that as an imperial cult with a temple in Ephesus, right on John's reader's doorstep. And this is the crossroads of empire. It's what made it so important to the Romans and what made it arguably so wealthy, because it was a main trade route. And you've got here a new Christian community in this part of the world, a Christian community that comes from pagan and Jewish backgrounds, and they're working out what it means to be faithful to God under pressure from paganism, as we'll see in a little while, under pressure from Roman military and economic and political power as well. The Romans have established, and right here we're in the part of the world which is the centre of all of this, they've established what they call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, there's a whole list of things that the Romans had done, but the main thing that they prided themselves on was that they had brought peace to their part of the world. But they'd brought peace at the price of the liberty of most of the people that they conquered. They ruled with a fairly firm hand. And the one thing that they did not tolerate was dissent and people not conforming and not fitting into the Roman way of life. If you were prepared to knuckle under and bow to the Roman sandal, then peace was possible, but it was at a price. And Christians found themselves in a situation where Caesar was affirmed as Lord and ruler of all things and bringer of peace. I'm going to show you now the first holiday slide that I've got for you to look at, and this is an inscription in the city of Pergamum, which is one of the letters was written to the church in Pergamum. You'll see at the northernmost of the churches there. And in this city of Pergamum, when Alex and I visited in 2012, we found this stone with an inscription, which is probably from a temple in Pergamum. And I'm not expecting you to read the Greek, but it comes from the time of Trajan, who was the emperor after Domitian. So this is probably about 15 years after the book of Revelation was written. And what that inscription to Trajan, you'll see his name on the third line down, with what looks like a capital T, P-A-I-A-N, is Trajan. But the first word there on the inscription at the top left is autocrat, the sole ruler. The next line begins with the word which looks like it begins with a K, Caesar. And then moving along a bit is an alpha, and then a theta, epsilon, omega, upsilon, theou, means God. Caesar and God. Trajan. Ariston, the very best. Sebaston, venerable. And then on the next line is a list of countries that he conquered. There's Germanicon. Dakikos is Dacia, which is in a part of modern Romania. Great victories that Trajan had won in his lifetime. And then the last lines here speak of the land and the sea. Tonges kai thalasar, kurion. of the land and the sea, Lord. So Trajan here, sole ruler, God, the very best, the venerable, of the land and the sea, Kyrios. That word Kyrios ring a bell with you? If you've said Kyrie eleison, it's the same word. The word that was ascribed to Jesus, the word Lord. When the early Christians said Jesus is Lord, Jesus Kyrios. Well, here, Trajan, Kyrios. There's a clash of cultures. Actually, what's happening is that the Christians are claiming a title that Caesar had already taken for himself and saying that's not Caesar's, that's Jesus's title, and we're taking it off of him. But this is the kind of conflict that these early Christians are finding themselves in, where they are constantly being reminded that they are in a pagan culture which worships the emperor as God and Lord of the land and the sea. So there's just a little bit of the background that sets the scene for where we're coming to this from. I want to just say a little bit now, if I may, about apocalyptic writing, because the revelation, the word revelation is a translation of a Greek word apocalypsis, from which we get the word apocalypse. In common usage, people talk about apocalyptic things, meaning a great disaster. So if there's an enormous fire or a natural disaster, sometimes it's described as an apocalyptic scene. That's a misuse of the word, because that's not what the word means at all. It means revelation in the sense of unmasking or unhiding something which is there, but is normally not visible to us. I remember preaching one Sunday when I was over in Cumbria, in Ambleside, and I was living in Appleby at the time, and I got up in Appleby at 7 o'clock. There was such thick fog I couldn't see the car on the drive, and I had a 45-minute drive under normal conditions to Ambleside in thick fog. It took me nearly 2 hours because the fog was so thick leaving Appleby. But as I drove in towards the Lake District, I remember driving up, if you know the A66 from Penrith towards Keswick, it goes up a hill just as you come up towards Blencathra. And as I drove up that hill, this fog turned from being grey to being silver and then white. And then I could see trees starting to appear at the side. And as I came up the road, the cloud completely disappeared and I was in blue sky. And in my rear view mirror, all I could see was fog, but all I could see in front of me was everything. Clear blue sky and sunshine and frost on the ground. It was a beautiful, beautiful scene. And I was about to preach on the book of Revelation, and I had an apocalypse on the A66 that morning, because as I drove out of the cloud and into the clarity, everything was revealed. It's not that it wasn't there when I was in the fog, it was just that I couldn't see it. It was hidden from my sight by the fog. But as the fog then burned away under the sun, everything was revealed. And the book of Revelation is like the sun burning off the fog and the mist to reveal everything that's in the world around us that's hidden in the fog. So that might seem strange to you, because the book of Revelation, for many of us, is obscure. And it's as if it's complicating things and making them harder to understand. But actually what it really is a way of opening our eyes to a different reality and looking at the world that we have in a different way and seeing things differently. And my promise to you is that as we look at the book of Revelation, it will make you see the world differently. If we read it properly and read it right, you will see things in the world that maybe you've not seen before, or you will see them in a different light, in a different perspective. And that's the purpose of apocalyptic writing. It's interesting, as I was preparing for this series of studies, I've been reading Revelation a little bit over the last month or two again. And what struck me one day last week as I was reading it through in a large chunk was how many times the writer says, I saw, I looked and I saw. I'm going to encourage you at the end of our session this evening to read through large chunks of the book of Revelation. But one thing that you might look for is how often the writer says, I saw. I looked and I saw. And that's a reflection of what Apocalypse is about, because it enables us to see. And I think it's not insignificant that the writer says so many times, I looked and I saw. And that takes us again to another aspect of apocalyptic writing that you will not be unfamiliar with if you've read it. And that is that it's extremely graphic. It is picture language. And in that sense, the book of Revelation and all apocalyptic literature is more like a graphic cartoon book than it's like a novel. Okay, more like a graphic cartoon book than a novel. And the imagery is graphic and it's vivid, even abstract. But you cannot get away from, you can't read Revelation without it conjuring up all kinds of images in your head. And some of those images are inevitably very difficult to grasp and to perceive, because the descriptions of them are quite bewildering and like a kaleidoscope of changing things over and over and over again. But it is a graphic way of writing and a pictorial way of writing that stimulates pictures in the mind. And that's quite important for us to acknowledge. And much of that imagery is obscure to us today in a way that it wouldn't have been to the first century readers of this in Asia Minor. They understood that imagery much as we might understand cartoon imagery that you might see in a newspaper today. If you see a cartoon and it has a picture of Uncle Sam, you know that that picture represents the United States. Or if you saw a bulldog with a Union Jack waistcoat on, that it's meant to represent Great Britain. These images are very readily recognised by us today because it's part of our culture and our way, what we've been brought up with and what we see and understand. Much of the book of Revelation would have been similar for those first century Christians. So a city on 7 hills or a beast with 7 heads, for them was Rome. It was as obvious as a bulldog in a Union Jack waistcoat is to us today. Very clearly, obviously Rome. What's your problem with it? You know, everybody knows that a 7-headed beast is Rome. Well, we don't recognise that instantly because we're 2,000 years on, and Rome is not what it was then. But that kind of graphic imagery and cartoon imagery would have been quite familiar to the people who first read it. I'm going to just pause and give anybody a chance if you want to say anything or ask anything at that point, because I don't want to just be spouting on to you this evening. Does anybody want to comment or ask anything or add anything to what I've said?
What do you actually get, Paul, when you translate that imagery into something which is more recognizable? Is there a sort of messenger? I was tempted to sort of look up messenger, so a translation which would sort of remove the kind of imagery which is not so accessible and replace with something which is more accessible to us. Yeah,
we'll be doing that over the next few weeks, Klaus. To be honest, we'll be looking at each of those images and we will unpack what those images represent. And then we can think about how they might apply in our world today. So you've got the image of the beast with 7 heads, you know, as Rome in its time. Now, Rome in our day is not the Rome of 2,000 years ago. But what it says is about empire and about political and economic and military might. And so we might transpose that into a different picture today. And that's part of the ongoing process with the book of Revelation, and it's what it invites us to do. I have to say, some of those images we still can't recognize what they understand, what they refer to now, because it's 2,000 years ago and we've lost the kind of, you know, the key that explains what they are and what they meant to those people. We can only speculate. So for example, the number of the beast, 666, there's enormous speculation about what that means, and there's no definitive definition of what that means, but there are various possibilities, and so some of the imagery remains a little bit obscure to us, but that's where interpretation comes in, and as I say, we'll look at some of those things as the weeks go by.
Paul, I've found what you've said so far very helpful, because I struggle with anything that is sort of a bit weird, you know, and when I've read bits of Revelation before, it's just, you know, it's not to my way of thinking at all, and I've really struggled with it. But to hear, you know, I'm interested to hear what more you have to say, because that has helped a lot already. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Hazel. That's good. That's good. Tony, are you?
My spacebar didn't work. I couldn't unmute when I wanted to. Yeah, just to say something about apocalyptic as a genre, it's not quite the same as prophecy. No. In broad brush terms, prophecy expects God to work in history by raising somebody up to do what he wants. So that he raised up Assyria to judge Israel, and then Babylon to deal with Assyria, and then Persia to deal with Babylon, and so on and so forth. Then you reach a point where what's gone wrong, or what is going wrong, is too big to be dealt with from within history. So the apocalyptic expectation is that he will intervene from outside history. And there are a lot of intertestamental apocalyptic books. I mean, the earliest book that we've got really is the book of Daniel, where what happens is somebody comes and says to our hero, let me take you backstage and show you what is set up and ready to roll. And that's what Revelation is saying. Essentially, Domitian, Rome, the threat is they're going to declare war on the people of God. And so what Revelation is saying is, if they declare war on the people of God, this is what God is going to do. Let's go backstage and see the events. And there's sequences of visions that when you put them together, they give, for us, a very broad brush view of this is how God will deal with those who threaten his people. So it's a particular genre, and there's all kinds of stuff in it, which, you know, we'll unpack as we get to them. But it says something about how we see God as being above and beyond history, as well as within history.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. And apocalyptic writings come from a recognition that we're in a situation where we're in worlds that conflict, that our Christian perception of the world is very different from other people's perception of the world. And that can cause conflict, and the Christians in this part of the world at that particular time were feeling very vulnerable. They were probably relatively numerous, but still a minority of the population, and they were living under a power that oppressed them, and that would go on to oppress them even more and much more. And they were constantly surrounded with the pressure from paganism and from the imperial worship to conform, to worship the emperor, because if you didn't worship the emperor, you were not a good member of the empire. And yet these Christians, they couldn't sacrifice to the emperor. They couldn't worship the emperor as a god, because there is only one God. And yet if they didn't worship the emperor as a god, they were deemed not to be loyal citizens. They were not good Roman citizens, and therefore they were threatening the Pax Romana, and therefore they were under pressure to conform and to give up their faith. How do you live as a Christian when you are in a minority and you are under a regime which is much more powerful than you and is insisting that you give up your way and live their way? That's the challenge that faced those early Christians in that part of the world. And this crisis situation may have echoes for us perhaps in our time. We can perhaps have some conversation about this later this evening, depending how time goes. But certainly over the next few weeks, one of the things that we will talk about is to what extent as Christians are we a minority, and where do we feel under pressure to conform to things which we cannot conform to renounce things which are dear to us? Do we feel that pressure? How do we cope with it? Revelation and all apocalyptic literature comes out of that clash of worlds where God's people are in conflict with the society that's all around them. Okay, let's move on then just a little bit and say a bit more about in the way of background. As Tony said, apocalyptic literature is very different to prophecy, and it's important to note the time scale of the book of Revelation. It is not just about the future. That's really important that we understand that. The book of Revelation is not just about the future. Various people have often used the book of Revelation throughout history to read it, and they've said, oh, well, this is that. So the seven-headed beast, the first Christians, as I've said, would have read that as Rome. Medieval Reformation Christians in the 16th century onwards looked and they said, oh, the seven-headed beast, that's the Roman Catholic Church. That's this being fulfilled here. In much more recent history, there have been those who looked and they saw the Treaty of Rome, which was signed in 1957, I think, with 7 members. And they said, oh, the European Economic Community is the seven-headed beast. And then, of course, the EU's expanded. And once it got more than 7 members, that kind of fell apart. Certainly when it got more than 10 members, that interpretation fell apart. But people throughout history have had that tendency to look at the book of Revelation and say, oh, this is that. And it's been something in our time, and it's encouraged them to say the end is near. Let me say, they were all wrong and they were all right. Yeah? Because the book of Revelation stands outside of time. It applies to no particular time, and it applies to every time. Okay, I'm sounding a bit like Dickens here with the start of the Tale of Two Cities, aren't I? It's no time and it's every time. What the book of Revelation does is it gives us a different way of looking at our history, and a way that applies eternally. That is, from beginning to end of our era. And this is true right from the very beginning. If you look at Revelation chapter 1 and verse 19, when the risen Jesus speaks to John, he says, "Write therefore what you have seen, what is now and what will take place later." Revelation 1 verse 19, what is now and what will take place later. And that's true all the way through. And that's because of the nature of who God is. We'll look at some of these next week a little bit when we look at chapter 1 in more detail. But look at verse 8 of chapter 1, where God announces himself. "I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." In other words, I am all of time, over all of time. I am Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. I am, I was, I will be. This is not just about the present, and it's not just about the final chapter of the book of life or the history of the world. This is a message from the God of eternity about all time, and it relates to all time. So the timescale of Revelation, although it extends forward to the end times, as we call them, when God will bring about a new heaven and a new earth, is actually the timescale is about all time and about all eternity. And what Revelation does is it opens up our vision so that we can see another dimension of history. A dimension that's there all along, like I was saying about the mist that hides the world from us sometimes until the sun burns it off and we can see everything. Well, the book of Revelation is telling us what's beyond our sight. It's there and it's real, even though we cannot see it. And it's a reality which is eternally present and yet hidden from mortal eyes. And it is made known to us through the gift of revelation. It is revealed to us. We could not see it with our normal human eyes and perspective. I mean, it is spiritually discerned in another way of putting it. So just to reiterate that, really, I think probably the most important thing to understand about the book of Revelation is that it's not about the end of the world, or at least it's not just about the end of the world. It is about the world. It's about who God is, what God is doing in the world, and what God is unveiling to us about the world. And that unveiling of the world, it will end the world. It will end the world as we see it, or it will end the way that we see the world. It will reveal to us a new way of looking at the world. Now that's a lot to take in, and I just want to pause and see whether anybody wants to comment or ask anything at that point, because I realise that's a very different way of looking at the book of Revelation to what many people do, and what many people have historically felt was the right thing to do.
I think, Paul, it's a relief. I think I find when you're saying that, it's a relief.
Yes.
Because we felt, or I have felt in the past, trying to read Revelation, just completely that this is going to be the end of the world. But that's so interesting now that you're going to open up a completely different way of looking at it. Yeah. Again, thank you. It's going to make a difference.
Thank you, Pamela. Yeah. If we look at the book of Revelation as a way of predicting the day of Jesus' return, we'll get it wrong. And history has shown time and time again that people who've looked at the book of Revelation to calculate dates and times have without exception been wrong. And that's not what it's for. It's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding the present. And yes, it does talk about the future, and it ends with the most glorious hope, doesn't it, of a new heaven and a new earth and the dwelling of God with his people. And we're not going to lose sight of that. It is about the end, and it's about the purpose of everything, and it's about God's vindication at the end, and how God will bring an end to the crisis that we are in and the suffering that we are in. But it is about the present and how we understand the present and live in the present as well. I just want to mention one other aspect of the symbolism of the book, which we will come up against a number of times over the next few weeks, and then there'll be just some opportunity for some discussion. And the symbolism I just want to say something about very, very briefly is about the symbolism of numbers that are used in the book of Revelation. Numbers are used are very important in the book of Revelation. And they are signs or they are symbols to the reader, not simply to be taken literally. And the point is that when these first Christians read these numbers, and it's the same in the book of Daniel from the Old Testament, so this was not a new thing for the early Christians. It was a common Jewish way of reading things. Certain numbers sparked something in their mind, and they said, "Oh, that's that. That's what this represents." And some of the key numbers that you'll probably be familiar with from the book of Revelation, the number 7, for example. And for the Jewish and the Christian mind, the number of 7 is the number for perfection or completion. And it comes from the 7 days of creation at the beginning of Genesis, when everything God looked and on the 7th day saw that it was very good. It was just as it was intended to be. It's the number of perfection and completion. And if you look through the book of Revelation, as we will do, in a couple of weeks, we'll start looking at the letter to the 7 churches. And the number 7 there is very significant because there were more than 7 churches that John could have written to in that area. But the letters come, well, I say John, of course, they're from Jesus. But the symbolism says this is the 7 churches. It's for the whole church, the complete church, because 7 says this is completion. As you read on, you'll see there are 7 seals and there are 7 trumpets and there are 7 this and that and the other throughout the book of Revelation. So 7 is the number of completion and perfection. It is also the number of complete evil. Because the important thing is completion, not necessarily goodness or evil, but completion. If you look into chapter 17 of Revelation, in chapter 17 and verses 3 and 4, and then 9 and 10, you've got the woman sitting on the seven-headed beast as a symbol of her, 7 hills, the 7 hills of Rome. And in that case, the 7 hills of Rome are the symbol of complete and utter evil. Yeah, so it's a symbol of totality and completeness. Is the number 7. Generally, it's a good number, but it can also represent 7 being the complete and utter final expression of evil as well. And in Revelation 17, you've got the 7 hills, the woman with the sitting on the 7 hills. There are 7 heads and 7 kings, and they are all symbols of evil in that chapter in Revelation 17. So that's the first number to draw your attention to, the number 7. The number 6, interestingly, is just short of perfection. In fact, you could say it's so far short of perfection, it's worse than bad. And one interpretation of 666 is it's not quite there, it's imperfect. And it's imperfection upon imperfection upon imperfection is 666. Or you could say it's bad, bad, bad. That's one interpretation of that number 666. It's bad, 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 because it falls short of completeness and perfection. There are other ways of looking at that number 666, which we may or may not come to over the next few weeks, but that's another way of, another significant number at least. A further significant number is the number 12. 12 represents, does anybody want to say? I'm sure you know these things anyway, some of you, don't you?
Tribes of Israel.
Yeah, the 12 tribes of Israel, and more generally, the people of God.
Oh.
Yeah, the 12 disciples. Yeah, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples, and therefore it's a symbol of the people of God. And when in chapter 7, you get in the vision 144,000. You've got there 12 times 12 times 1,000, which is 10 times 10 times 10. You've got a picture of the whole people of God, saying it's an enormous number of God's people. So the 144,000, the Jehovah's Witnesses at one time took that literally to say that there would be 144,000 elect people in heaven. They took that number literally. And then they got into a problem because they found that there were more than 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in the world, and some of them were going to miss out. So then they had to redefine that and say, well, actually, no, there are 144,000 elect, but most of us are not elect, but we'll be in the new earth, not in the new heaven. And they've had to redefine it. But they got into that problem because they took the 144,000 to be a literal number. What it is a number that to the Jewish mind would have said, oh, 12 times 12, that's a glorious company of the people of God, times 1,000, a marvelous, marvelous, enormous, countless number of God's saints is 144,000. And that's what it would have figured to them, far more important than the door slamming shut when 144,000 had walked in, and not one more was going to be allowed beyond that. And the reason, the giveaway for that, is if you look at Revelation chapter 7, where it describes the 144,000 and says there are 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. The next verse says in Revelation 7 verse 9, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb, wearing white robes and holding palm branches. So there's a number that nobody can count, and the 144,000 is immediately revealed as a symbolic number and not a literal number. 12 is the number of gates into the New Jerusalem, a city with 4 walls and 3 gates on each side, and it's that number of it's that representation of God's people being gathered together as God's people, God's elect, is the number 12. So that's a further number, and one number that will crop up again is the number 3.5. 3.5 is a strange number to crop up, but it's half of 7. And that in itself might suggest something. But if you look at chapter 11 of the book of Revelation and verse 9 of Revelation, chapter 11 and verse 9, for 3.5 days, men from every people, tribe, language and nation will gaze on the bodies of the 2 witnesses who've been killed. For 3.5 days. But then in chapter 12 and verse 6, you get the woman fleeing into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, to save you doing the maths, that's 3.5 years. 1,260 days is 3.5 years. Back in chapter 11 at verse 2, there's a reference to the Gentiles trampling the court of the temple. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. Now, those of you who are quick at maths will tell me how many years that is. 3.5. Yeah. And it refers back to the book of Daniel, where Daniel on a number of occasions talks about a time, times and a half time. And that's a time and times and a half time. 3.5. If you count the times as 2, time, times and a half time is 3.5. And Daniel makes that same equation with 3.5 years and the days of 3.5 years through that times and a half time. And what it's like, the number 3.5, as you read through, it's a bit like half time. Just because as it's halfway to 7, it's a bit like half time. And it's the point at which things often turn around, just as they do in football. Think of it as half time. 3.5 is halfway to 7 and it's half time. It's a time of turnaround, and it's kind of an in-between time where things just kind of suddenly stop and change. And we'll see that number referring. So when you see a 3.5, you'll know that that's a time when a season comes to an end and something else is about to change. The ends are going to the teams are going to change ends or something like that at that point. And all of these numbers were triggers to the first century readers of the book of Revelation. So I hope this has not mystified you, but just highlighted to you that what we are dealing with here is a book that really seeks to make sense of a world in which we live, but it does so in very graphic terms, and in spiritual terms, we might say, in symbolic terms, and in ways that open themselves up to stimulating images and pictures in our minds that we might not otherwise have come to. And just to encourage you, I want to give you one verse that for me summarizes the whole book of Revelation. And it's not actually from the book of Revelation. And the verse I would point you to is in John's Gospel. And it's John chapter 15. And I forget it's the last verse of John chapter 15. John chapter 16, John chapter 16, verse 33. Jesus said, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Now that's not from the book of Revelation, obviously. It's from the Gospel according to John. Probably not written by the same John, but we'll not get drawn on that one at the moment. But that verse, regardless, summarizes for me the whole message of the book of Revelation to a people living under the Pax Romana that insisted on complete allegiance and worship of the emperor as a god and submission to Roman economic and political might and to spiritual power, to Christians living in that kind of crisis situation where they were constantly pressurized to conform to a Pax Romana, which robbed them of their peace with God, because they couldn't submit to the Pax Romana and to God without compromising their faith. Into that Pax, the Pax Romana, Jesus' words, so that in me you may have peace, not in Rome, but in me. In this world, Jesus continued, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And that's the subliminal message, if you like, of the whole of the book of Revelation, that there will be trouble for us in this world. There will be conflict. There will be challenges. There will be time when we have to stand up for what we believe in, and that will invite opposition. But Jesus has overcome. And as you know, the book of Revelation finishes with that glorious, victorious picture of the triumph of Jesus and the kingdom of this world becoming the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. And so that verse in John chapter 16 and verse 33 summarizes for me the message of the book of Revelation. And I'll refer back to that a number of times over the next few weeks to remind you of it. Okay. Well, I've talked a lot, and I promise that you'll get more opportunity to discuss over the next few weeks. Can I just sketch out for you something that I will confirm to you in an email that I'll send round, just of the programme over the next few weeks. Next week we'll look at chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, which introduces God and God's people and the risen Jesus, and that starts the letter off in an obvious way. That's why we should begin there. So we'll look at chapter 1 next week. Then we're going to look the following week at chapter 11, which in many ways is the very heart of the book of Revelation. It's more or less central to the book, but it's also at the kind of beating heart of the book. So we're going to look at chapter 1, then chapter 11. Then we're going to come back to chapters 2 and 3. And the letter to the 7 churches. We're just going to spend 2 weeks on those 7 letters to the churches. And then we shall look in the remaining sessions at the rest of the book of Revelation in the unfolding visions that emerge through that. And if I may, I'd like just to close by setting you some homework. And your homework is, if you're able to read through the whole book of Revelation at one sitting.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that is what I suggested. To read through it at one sitting. I estimate it will take about an hour and a half for most of us. If you were to, I read it myself at the speed that I would read it if I were reading it out loud, and it took about an hour and a half. So get your diary, look at a point where you can set aside an hour and a half, switch Homes Under the Hammer off and count down, and for an hour and a half, put in your diary, read Revelation. Read it through in one chunk. If you can do that over the next week, or certainly over the next fortnight at some point, that I believe will be of great benefit to you. Now, if you can't manage that, that's fine, I understand that. Try to read through in 2 halves. Read chapters 1 to 11 and then 12 to the end in 2 halves. If you can do it all in one book, in one go, that's best. That's the gold standard. Do it in 2 halves if you can't do it in one go. Or if you can't manage that, just read the first half. But one thing that I'm quite sure of is that if you read through the book, you may have done this before, I don't know, but if you read through the book in one go, you will see it in a different way to the way that you've perhaps already seen it. Okay? And just make a note as you do so of things that stand out to you, things that are repeated, patterns that might emerge, things that just strike you maybe for the first time as you read it through in a large chunk like that. Frankly, most of the time when I read letters, books of the Bible, I read a little bit, so I might read one of the letters in chapter 2 of Revelation or something like that. That would be my normal way of going about these things. But the first time I read Revelation through from beginning to end at one sitting, it gave me a totally different perspective on the whole book. And I want to encourage you to do that, because the important thing with a graphic book like this is that you let the whole big picture strike you. Don't get drawn in to a little detail in a corner of the picture until you've seen the whole thing. And when you've seen the whole thing, the little bit in the corner, you realize maybe is not quite what you thought it was, or maybe isn't as important as you thought it was, or you understand it in a way that you didn't before, because it's so important to see the whole picture. And certainly when this book was first written, that's the way that it would have been delivered to the early church, that it would have been read through the whole thing all at one go. That was the intention, and it's a really good way to get into it now. Okay. Folks, I do want these sessions to finish within the hour, because I think that's only fair and right that you have that expectation and that we stick to some kind of discipline on that. But I do want to give you opportunity, if you wish to stay for a little while in a bit of conversation. I'm happy for us to do that, and you can stay for as long as you want and go when you're ready. If you want to go now, that's fine. If you want to stay for a little while and then go, that's fine. I'll go when I've had enough, but I'll leave you talking if you're still going, and you can have some conversation. But I think that there's some important things to think about here that we could talk about, as for example, what do you think of the idea that there is a hidden, invisible reality behind the material world that we see? Is that something that is strange to you, bizarre to you? Does it make sense to you? Or is it complete nonsense? What do you think of the idea of the hidden, invisible reality that's there alongside us all the time, but we just don't see it? So that's one thing that we could talk about. And another thing we can talk about is where we feel, if we feel pressure to go along with the crowd, and with the way that wider society live, and we maybe feel expected that we should live the same way, and does that conflict in any way and at any point with our Christian faith? So we can talk about that. If anybody wants to start us off on those things, that'd be wonderful. But do feel free, if you've had enough, to go and get yourself a cuppa.